Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Professor in Practice in the Financial Markets Group at the London School of Economics, and also an Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute. And I'm here with Dr. Ellen Quigley, Special Advisor on Responsible Investment to the Chief Financial Officer at Cambridge University, to discuss the series Harald Walkate and I wrote for ECGI, titled Does Sustainable Investing Work? So, Ellen, thanks for joining me. Before we get into it, could you briefly describe what your role as Special Advisor on Responsible Investment involves?
Absolutely, Tom. So I'm a bit of an odd character in this space in that I'm half-time an academic, so I actually
Mhm.
study this stuff, and then half-time I'm a practitioner in that role that you just mentioned. And essentially, what that means that I get to do is to test out some of what the literature indicates in the real world, both things. So we've been able to do things like launch a request for proposals for cash products that don't contribute to fossil fuel expansion with 75 higher education institutions
Mhm.
across the UK signed on. And I believe you're aware of this new bond index that the university is launching in
Yeah, and
association.
I want to talk about that later. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So those are the sorts of things that we get to do that's quite practical, but is built out of a body of evidence that.
And what is the money that you're responsible for advising on?
Well, I mainly help the bursars of the colleges. So they have about the same amount as is in the central endowment.
Hmm.
So I help the university centrally with their liquid funds,
Hmm.
and then the bursars of the colleges. And then sometimes I help out with the endowment as well.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks for joining us to talk about all of these issues. And I'd like to start with your reactions to the series of articles that Harold and I put together, and we will put a link to those original articles in the show notes. But in brief, we analysed what needs to be true for sustainable investing to have impact, which we expressed as first, the sustainable investing activity needs to have some effect on companies. Second, those companies need to respond to that effect by changing what they do. And third, those changes have to persist rather than being offset by other actions of competitors or other actors in the system. And when we reviewed the academic evidence on this, which we know you have done too, it suggested to us that conventional sustainable investing techniques quite often struggle to make it through all three phases, which led us to conclude that sustainable investors wanting to have impact perhaps need to focus less on achieving sustainability outcomes directly and maybe a little bit more on trying to influence the circumstances in which good outcomes can occur. But in terms of your reaction to our work, let's start with the positive. What did you think we got right?
I could not agree more with the focus on, in particular, government action,
Hmm.
legislation being, I think many, if not most people in this space agree is probably the number one facilitative lever
Mm.
in terms of decarbonization of the real economy.
Mm.
And the other is the critique around voluntary action. And I think
Mm.
that's a critique that hasn't gotten out there enough. So those are the two big things I really agree with. But in general, I think I'm grateful for the scrutiny that you and others have provided to this space because I think a lot of I've been guilty of overclaiming at times myself, and I
Right.
feel like you guys have been a helpful check on any tendency in that direction. So yeah, in general, I'm really glad this conversation is happening. It's the conversation we should be having.
Mm. Okay, so you've been very nice so far. So what did you disagree with, or what do you think we got wrong, or perhaps just sort of missed or underemphasized?
So I really do. So I know I've been nice thus far, and that's not always characteristic. But actually, I do hope that it can just be additive, as in,
Yeah.
I'm so happy that this conversation is happening that I really do just want to add additional
Right.
ingredients. So those that I would particularly focus on are one is a kind of framing piece.
Hmm.
And that is expansion of green investments and technologies. And I just want to point out a couple reasons that that's not my primary focus. So what we've seen thus far is an addition. So even as renewables grow at an unprecedented pace and come down to unprecedented low costs, fossil fuel expansion is still happening, and that's what the atmosphere actually cares about. And actually, the countries in which cost of capital is still a barrier are not the countries in which we have the emissions we really need to deal with. So my primary focus is in on those top emitting countries and where their emissions come from, which is primarily a fossil fuel combustion thing. And of course, the top emitting sector is actually utilities. And I think this is another critique I just have of this entire space is that when we talk about fossil fuels, we tend to just talk about the fossil fuel sector themselves. And I think as soon as we start looking at utilities, some of the things that you guys point out don't actually apply. So for example, if a utility doesn't build a new gas-fired power plant and you have that focus on fossil fuel expansion, it's unlikely that someone else is going to build that new fossil fuel infrastructure themselves, or that that'll be financed in some other way. Like it's less likely that you'll end up with those kind of negative spillovers. But also, I think if you have that kind of focus on constraining fossil fuel expansion, you have to look at debt. And that's the other thing. I think you guys have missed the public markets debt piece, because that's actually where a lot of this new financing of fossil fuels comes from. And that actually gets at national oil companies, private companies, and a lot of the other things that you refer to as being gaps. So actually, if you look at the debt side of the equation, you've got those. I mean, as we know, about 57 companies, it's been suggested by recent academic evidence, are responsible for about 80% of emissions from fossil fuels and cement companies since the Paris Agreement was signed. So it's not that many companies, and they probably are represented on the debt side just because they're large, which isn't the case in the kind of other analyses that you're doing, where you're kind of contrasting private markets with public markets, whereas what we really need to be looking at is primary market financing. And we haven't seen very much attention go into that from an academic standpoint, but we also haven't seen much practice in that regard. So there was that Banque de France study in 2019, I believe, that looked at the application of exclusions following the French legislation, and they found that 4% applied to bonds and 96% to public equity. So I don't think we even know what the potential effect on cost of capital could be like on the debt side, because it's just basically not really been done.
When you talk about utilities, is that a particular focus for you, or are you using that as a for instance? Because there is this other point of view where people say, actually, we should be focused on the users of fossil fuels rather than the providers of fossil fuels. And so that could include heavy industry, cement manufacturers and what have you. But are you seeing utilities as a particularly special case, or just as an illustration of that kind of group of fossil fuel users?
Yes, because it's where the growth in demand for fossil fuels is happening the most. So there are hundreds of new gas-fired power plants going up in wealthy countries alone right now, including in grids where there's still a lot more room to run with renewables. So, and again, that's by far the top emitting sector. So if we're going to do something about climate change, sure, we need to get to hard to abate sectors and so on and so forth. But in the utility sector, we actually have the alternative technology already. And yet, because probably in part because of supply chains and skill sets and the approvals processes and so on and so forth, things that people know how to do when it comes to fossil fuel infrastructure, but not necessarily renewables. There's kind of like almost like an inertia or a cognitive barrier, behavioral barrier in place to kind of get away from that fossil fuel expansion track.
That's interesting. So, and I think you've kind of, in how you've identified areas that you think we've not paid enough attention to, I think you've answered my next question probably, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and you can sort of maybe give you an opportunity if you want to reframe anything. And so, I mean, you're an asset owner or an advisor to asset owners, who are concerned about climate change and climate concerned asset owners. So what is it that you've concluded is the kind of best area of focus of your efforts? Is it really about this sort of debt markets and utilities, or is there more to it than that?
I would say, and actually this links to another critique or addition that I hope
that
which is the social discourse element, which I think actually drives a lot of the real impact that we've seen out of the divestment movement. So I would recommend looking at the Becht et al. Paper on divestment and others like it that suggests that there has been more of an indirect effect on legislation and social discourse that's actually more likely, in my view, to have an impact than any particular sale of a particular security. So we kind of started to recognize at Cambridge that we have more fame than money. That's the phrase I tend to use.
Right.
And since we have more fame than money, we should really be looking to make the maximum social discourse play. And what that means is trying to do things that highlight the most important gaps in this space. So we really tried to focus on debt markets, not just because of the direct potential impact on debt markets, but the very idea that we can actually highlight the role that debt markets play in fossil fuel expansion.
Right.
And we also focus most of our direct engagements on banks and asset managers, because there we can, any change that we make will then ripple out into trillions in AUM. So we're looking at the kinds of institutions that are more likely to be able to listen to us. As you rightly point out, a lot of engagement is win-win. My personal view is that externalities are profitable, and only in the cases of win-win is unlikely for most of the companies that we're looking at, and anything that's not is unlikely to get over the line unless it's a fairly small amount of the total business, which is the case for banks and asset managers. So you're not asking them to make as big as a sacrifice as you would have to with a fossil fuel company, which you're effectively saying wind yourself down a sense of time scale. So with banks and asset managers, this is a tiny percentage of their overall business. And they care a lot about reputation because they're consumer-facing businesses. That's another thing that comes out in the engagement literature.
And so, with that sort of social discourse play that you're talking about, is that right with a view to kind of putting it on the agenda of governments, or just highlighting areas that other investors should be kind of picking up the baton on, or is it a bit of both?
I hope all of the above, and we could include other actors we would want to highlight this issue to as well. We aren't looking at the main source of locked in future emissions in any of these initiatives that we're looking at. So voluntary or not, we're not even looking at the most important factors as to whether we can decarbonize. We're instead using measures that are highly gameable. We're really trying to keep things simple. There's some other evidence in the academic literature that points to the reasons for that. So we keep things really simple, and we focus them on where they're most likely to have an impact, where the impact would spread the most, and where the impact could contribute to social discourse changes across quite a lot of actors. We would hope to center their attention on these really key issues.
I want to come on to this index, which you've mentioned a couple of times, and it references this point about data gaps and so on. Just before doing that, I want to just stick on this kind of utilities point a little bit more. So, can you just get a bit more specific about in what you would like to see those utilities do or not do? What actually is the behaviour of the utilities that you're trying to change?
So the main thing is the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure, mainly power plants. But of course, you still have to get into the LNG space as well. There are analysts suggesting that LNG infrastructure is already overbuilt out to 2030. What that LNG capacity is driving or is supporting is the growing number of gas-fired power plants that we are building still in wealthy countries all over the world, including in Europe. And yet what it actually does is it puts at risk energy security. The reason that we've had to go out and build all of this LNG infrastructure is that already the power systems of wealthy countries in Europe were overly reliant on Russia. And frankly, the other top producers of gas are not the best regimes to have to rely on either. So yeah, in my view, both for reasons of energy security, cost for consumers, and for the climate, the number one thing we need to do is to avoid building new, in particular, gas-fired power plants, especially now that we understand, because of recent satellite technology advancements, the degree to which methane leakage is an issue.
And in simple terms, you're wanting them to invest in renewable capacity as opposed to fossil fuel capacity for a given gigawatt that they're putting on the system. Is that? It's as simple as that, is it?
Yeah, renewables and storage and interconnections with other jurisdictions. You can replace fossil fuels in the grid. Yeah.
And how do you think about kind of the potential consequences of that in the context of, I mean, obviously there's this sort of, you framed it partly in terms of energy security, but there's a counter argument that energy security also requires us to build out all manner of energy kind of sources, given that we seem to find it so difficult to build kind of grid infrastructure and interconnections, and permitting delays things massively. I mean, so how do you think about kind of the potential knock-on consequences if that renewables infrastructure can't be brought on stream because of perhaps inadequate government support or framing? I mean, is that something that concerns you in this stance, or do you think that's somebody else's problem to solve? How do you think about that?
So if you were to be asking me what's the number one policy ask, it's grid
Mm,
up
right.
because it is so facilitative of
Yeah.
EPC. The thing is that's going to happen at some stage anyway, because it
Mm,
has to. So it's
mm,
just when are you going to do that? My hope is that governments are increasingly recognizing that absolutely critical piece.
mm,
I'll still say, though, that there are plenty of grids now that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels. They can still add a lot more renewables without having to continue to build new fossil fuel infrastructure
mm,
before they run into a grid balancing problem.
mm, mm,
But also, frankly, in a country like the UK, the marginal cost of electricity is set by gas
mhm.
all the time. So the cost implications are pretty widespread.
So I would now like to come on to this index that you've been creating, which I think launched, was it 2 weeks ago or very recently anyway? And I'm interested to hear more about this. What is it and what you're trying to do with it?
So it's very on brand in that it really does just look at fossil fuel expansion.
Hmm.
And it's not just looking at fossil fuel companies that are building new pipelines or exploring for new reserves.
Hmm.
It's really focused on utilities that are building that new demand side infrastructure,
Hmm.
and any other institution that is either building new infrastructure, exploring for new reserves, or financing or facilitating those fossil fuel expansionists. So we'll have quite a few exclusions in the fossil fuel and utilities sectors. And then we've got a bit of a different approach to banks and insurers, whereby we exclude the top in absolute terms. And then we've got a few other criteria that allow us to distinguish the next layer, which is those that are going to be heavily underweighted in the index, all the way out to companies, banks that will be overweighted in the index because they're not engaging in the financing or facilitation of fossil fuel expansion. Um, and so the idea here is that we actually concentrate the bond market's attention on those really key metrics. Again, very, very simple. We're not talking about blank percentage decrease in emissions covering scopes blank and blank by blank year.
Mm, mm,
Um, highly, highly
mm,
game. We're just looking at fossil fuel expansion activity and the financing and
mm,
underwriting thereof. And then we have an academic board that oversees the framework that guides
mm,
all of this. And I think the main thing that distinguishes it, aside from actually looking at fossil fuel infrastructure, which again is just missing from so many of the frameworks and initiatives in this space, is that you could actually be a fossil fuel company that is re-included in the index if you are not engaging in fossil fuel expansion and you're phasing down at a reasonable
mm,
speed. So there's kind of a forgiveness element that is
mhm,
not normally a part of these sorts of things, and that's also
mm.
for deliberate design reasons.
So if I understand, so for the utilities, it's a binary thing. So if you're involved in fossil fuel expansion, you're out of the index. Is that
Same with
correct?
fossil fuel companies. Yeah.
If the fossil, yeah, but if it's a finance company, then there's a more kind of complex thing where you're sort of that will be one consideration, but there's another range of factors that you're also accounting for.
Yes. Although that again, it's actually the same activities. Like we're only taking into account absolute levels of fossil fuel financing
Hmm.
and some relative measures just to capture any banks that might be smaller but are more disproportionately involved
Hmm.
in fossil fuel financing.
Mm.
It's really the same base metrics though. It's all about fossil fuel expansion.
Right, right. And what were some of the challenges in putting that together?
Um, Myriad.
Mm,
It's a very complex thing to do.
mm,
We're a university, so it's not normal for universities to develop their own bond indices.
mm,
Um, what we really had to do is to develop the framework and the kind of scientific basis behind it, and then to put out an RFP for index providers who could do it. And again, none of them were able to tell us which companies were engaging in fossil fuel expansion.
Right.
And they all had to go out and look for different data sources and so on and so forth. And an NGO that we work with fairly closely, Urgewald, is now involved with our index. So for the first time, we'll actually have data on fossil fuel expansion at that index level. So that's the goal here, actually, is to really just highlight the role of debt in fossil fuel expansion, to identify the top contributors to fossil fuel expansion, so that all that kind of attention and focus can go towards a smaller number of high impact asks in an asset class where there is almost nothing else out there. If we were trying to compete on the public equity side, there's so many products, it would be pretty impossible to get that kind of concentration effect. But what we're really hoping here is that we can get a lot of voices behind the same very precise and high impact asks.
Right. I see. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the data availability was one of the key aspects, because there seems to be so much data about everything, but this is an area where there was a gap. So how have your providers actually overcome that gap? I mean, if it's data that isn't disclosed, how have they gone about that?
Well, so Urgewald collects those data, because the thing is, with new fossil fuel infrastructure, it's observable from space, whether you're building a new pipeline or a new power plant, and you have permitting processes that are public and go out quite a ways. It's actually a lot more observable and gameable than most of the indicators that we tend to use in this space.
I'm interested in your sort of perspectives on the impact of this, because I mean, it's the evidence that does exist on cost of capital impacts, even in debt markets, is that the impacts are quite modest. How much hope do you have that this is actually going to have a transformational effect on what these utilities and banks actually do? How much hope do you hold out for that?
Such a good question, Tom. I mean, I am reserving judgment until we see what actually happens. But I'll tell you what I'll be looking for. So my hope is that if we can get some actual focus on debt markets, because again, we don't know what the potential cost of capital implication is, because it is dominated by primary market financing as opposed to public equity side. So I would not be too surprised to see some effect there, although I would actually hope instead that some companies would just decide not to build the new fossil fuel infrastructure and avoid the problem in the first place. And we'll be able to study that. We've got a whole academic program built around the bond index to be able to track this stuff. But I think for me, the most important potential outcomes are actually more systemic and that won't be observable using those metrics. And it'll be much more about how much are policymakers, other investors, and other key figures focusing on fossil fuel expansion and fossil fuel infrastructure in particular. We'll probably be able to kind of trace that back. So my hope is that regulators, lawmakers, industry bodies looking at the utility sector and so on and so forth would start to attend to that priority.
So you mentioned there that you've got an academic body that's looking at this project with a view to future research that could be done on the impacts of the index. Can you just expand on that a little bit? Because I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so we have an academic board that's overseeing the actual framework. So that's what the index provider will be interpreting in deciding which companies are in and out of the index. So that's against our framework. But then separately, there will be a group of academics carrying out this research program. There probably won't be a whole lot of overlap between the academic board and that group, because the academic board has sector-specific expertise on those 4 sectors. Like, they've been kind of brought on board for a very particular purpose, and that is to assess that framework. And that other research is kind of happening as normal within the University of Cambridge.
So is there anything else you'd like to talk about in this whole area that we've been discussing today?
I think there are just a couple of other things to round out, Tom. So the first is I actually just want to iron back over that social discourse piece for a second, because I want to kind of talk through that theory of change. It's one I had not been persuaded of before writing the divestment report for the University of Cambridge. And it's this idea that we tend to, laws and norms are really intertwined. Typically laws represent norms, and then they can reinforce norms once they're enacted. we don't tend to legislate things until they're viewed as sufficiently bad. And that's why the divestment movement has focused on stigmatizing fossil fuels and really focusing attention on fossil fuels because they weren't even mentioned in the Paris Agreement. So the idea is really to focus on fossil fuel combustion as the primary cause of climate change. So that's one really important piece. The other is that I think your framework would really benefit from looking at the combination of tools and tactics. There are several studies that suggest that the combination of divestment and engagement together is stronger than either one of them in isolation. And I think using multiple tools, I mean, what your work has done is to kind of examine each tool in isolation, but it's, in my view, more likely that you'll see a response with the combination of those tools. And that's been behind the design of things like our cash request for proposals, by the way. It's, making sure that you kind of back up engagement with actual movement of money. But also in general, I would just say director votes in combination with some of these other debt strategies. I noticed that director votes didn't come up in your engagement review so much. And I think that one's, the results are significantly better than for other forms of engagement when you look at the literature in the round. So I would say director votes can kind of go with a lot of these other approaches. And the combination of these tools is more likely to be effective.
Yeah, I accept all of those points. I mean, I suppose the one thing that just sort of worries me about this theory of change in general is that, I mean, if you take something like the tobacco industry, right, which is sort of doesn't serve any great kind of social utility, right? If you stigmatize it, then probably you can decouple it from political support, and that can help to increase regulation of it, although it's far from driven it out of business. The whole kind of issue of fossil fuels and energy generation is so sort of intertwined with our economy and energy security, and the absolute political necessity for people to have in rich countries continuous access to affordable energy, that pushing away at kind of one part of the supply mechanism runs into the risk of hitting political roadblocks if there's not actually political action on the other side to ensure that the replacements are in place for it. And it makes me wonder how far that theory of change can work in an area that is so intertwined in things that people hold as so important in society and which are politically so critical, really. That I suppose is my worry about this extrapolation of a sort of what affects things company by company versus what can flow through into a system.
I love that question and concern, Tom, because I think you're exactly right. We have to have like something that pushes on many parts of the system at once. And I just want to say, like, investors cannot be the sole actors who are going to, as we started this conversation, it's legislation is the number one facilitator. So it's like what helps make that legislation more possible. If people don't even recognize where the problem is coming from, you're unlikely to get the demand side or supply side regulation or international agreements that you actually need. But the other thing that and this is something I probably should have raised when thinking about your policy proposals, the big problem is negative lobbying, as in lobbying against sensible climate policy. And again, if you put 57 companies that account for the vast majority of the emissions, that lobbying activity is not evenly distributed around the world. Investors actually have a special lever because in the places in which the politicians are least likely to regulate, they've actually got a more global pressure being brought to bear on those relevant companies. And again, the utility sector, at least in the US, actually outspends the fossil fuel sector in terms of anti-climate lobbying. So we can't really just look at the fossil fuel side. We have to look at utilities as well. And we have to handle the negative. We can't just positive policy engagement. I absolutely agree with you. But actually, I think the number one focus is the negative lobbying because it is so concentrated where the issues are greatest.
Yeah, and that is a dimension that we referenced, and I think it's welcome that's coming up the agenda. I think investors are going to. It's going to be interesting to see how far investors push that agenda, particularly in the current environment. But I do agree it's a very important one.
Well, right now they're only asking for transparency too. probably needs to go a little beyond that if we want to actually address anti-climate lobbying.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that all plays out. Well, Ellen, thanks very much for spending the time today. Really interesting discussion, and actually fascinating to discuss how you're bringing academia and practice together in the creation of this this new tool. And it's going to be really interesting to watch how it develops over the next few years.